you still believe honesty protects you. It doesn't. The world rewards predators, not saints. If you hear one warning this year, hear this. Morality is camouflage for power. You were not raised to become powerful. You were raised to become acceptable. From childhood, the script was written for you long before you understood what power was. Be honest, be humble, be fair, be kind, share, forgive, obey. These words were repeated so often they hardened into law inside your mind, not because they were true, but because they were useful. Useful to someone else. The first deception was subtle. You were taught that morality was universal, that goodness was the highest form of strength, that if you behaved correctly, the world would reward you. Authority figures reinforced it. Teachers praised it. Society celebrated it. But Nietzsche saw something most people never dare to confront. Morality is not a universal truth. Morality is a strategy, and strategies are created by groups trying to survive. To understand this, you must stop thinking like a citizen and start thinking like a strategist. Throughout history, two psychological forces have always existed: those who possess power and those who fear it. The powerful shape the world directly. The fearful shape it indirectly. The fearful cannot dominate physically. They cannot conquer. They cannot impose will through strength. So they invent a different weapon: moral law. Nietzsche called this slave morality, not because slaves were weak in body, but because they were forced to survive through psychological warfare instead of direct control. When a group lacks strength, it does not challenge power head-on. It rewrites the rules of the game. Strength becomes cruelty. Dominance becomes arrogance. Ambition becomes greed. Independence becomes selfishness. Meanwhile, weakness is renamed virtue. Obedience becomes goodness. Submission becomes humility. Powerlessness becomes purity. And suddenly, the entire moral map flips. The predator becomes evil. The obedient become righteous. This inversion is one of the most successful psychological strategies in human history. Because once a society accepts it, control no longer requires chains. People begin policing themselves. Think about how early this programming begins. A child who asserts dominance is corrected immediately. Don't be bossy. A child who competes too aggressively is warned. That's not nice. A child who refuses to share what he earned is shamed. That's selfish. But watch carefully. No one corrects weakness. No one punishes passivity. No one disciplines dependency. Because the system does not fear weak people. It fears independent ones. Nietzsche understood something uncomfortable. Societies that preach absolute morality are rarely protecting goodness. They are protecting stability. Stability for the structure. Stability for those who already control it. If every ambitious individual followed his instinct for power without restraint, hierarchies would constantly collapse and rebuild. New leaders would rise. Old authorities would be challenged. But moral frameworks slow this process down. They convince ambitious men to restrain themselves, to doubt their instincts, to feel guilt for wanting more. This is the psychological cage. And cages work best when the prisoner believes they are sacred. Look at how modern societies treat ambition. The moment someone seeks authority, others immediately question his character. They accuse him of arrogance. They warn about corruption. They suggest power itself is dangerous. But notice something strange. The same society still requires leaders. Power never disappears. It simply becomes invisible. Someone always holds it.
But while most people are taught to distrust their desire for power, a smaller group quietly studies it, understands it, and claims it. Nietzsche called these individuals creators. They do not inherit morality, they examine it, they dissect it, they decide which rules serve them and which rules exist to restrain them. This is the first psychological fracture most people never experience. The moment you realize that morality is not sacred, it is strategic. Once that realization enters your mind, something irreversible happens. You begin observing the world differently. You start noticing how moral outrage appears exactly when someone threatens existing structures. You see how society praises harmless goodness, but grows uncomfortable around raw competence. You see how power often hides behind the language of virtue. And slowly, the illusion cracks. The system you trusted was never designed to produce powerful individuals. It was designed to produce manageable ones. Nietzsche's warning was not gentle, it was brutal. A man who blindly worships morality becomes predictable. A predictable man becomes controllable, and a controllable man will spend his entire life defending rules that quietly ensure he never rises beyond them. The tragedy is that most people will defend those rules fiercely, not because they benefit from them, but because questioning them would destroy the identity they built their life around. Which means the first step toward power is not gaining strength, it is surviving the collapse of a belief, the belief that goodness protects you. Because once that belief dies, you begin seeing the world as it truly is, not as a moral battlefield, but as a strategic one. And on that battlefield, the obedient rarely win. Once you understand that morality is not sacred, the next realization becomes even more disturbing. Morality is not simply belief, it is technology, a psychological system engineered to regulate behavior without visible force. Powerful rulers throughout history understood a simple problem. Controlling people through violence alone is inefficient. Violence creates resistance. Fear creates rebellion. Armies require maintenance. But moral systems solve this problem elegantly. When morality is internalized, people control themselves. No chains, no guards, no walls. Only guilt. This is the hidden machinery Nietzsche exposed. Guilt is one of the most powerful psychological weapons ever created because it does something extraordinary. It turns aggression inward. Instead of challenging authority, individuals begin questioning themselves. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm selfish. Maybe I'm the problem. This is the silent victory of moral power. Because once a man begins attacking his own instincts, he becomes easier to govern than any prisoner in a cage. Nietzsche called this transformation, the internalization of instincts. Human beings were originally creatures of expansion. They competed, dominated, conquered, and asserted themselves openly. But as civilizations formed, those instincts became dangerous to social stability. So, they were redirected, not eliminated, redirected. Aggression turned into guilt, ambition turned into shame, dominance turned into moral anxiety. Instead of fighting rivals, individuals began fighting themselves. This is why moral cultures produce enormous psychological tension. People feel constant pressure to suppress their natural drives. They apologize for ambition. They feel uneasy about power. They hesitate when dominance would benefit them. And hesitation is lethal in power dynamics, because while one man hesitates, another advances. This mechanism becomes even more effective when society adds social surveillance. Not official surveillance, social surveillance. Neighbors judging neighbors, co-workers judging co-workers, friends judging friends. Every group becomes its own enforcement unit. Nietzsche understood that once moral language dominates a culture, control no longer requires kings or tyrants. Ordinary people become the guardians of the system themselves. They shame deviation. They punish ambition. They attack anyone who refuses to obey the emotional rules of the group. You can see this pattern everywhere once you recognize it. When someone speaks too confidently, they are labeled arrogant. When someone refuses emotional manipulation, they are labeled cold. When someone pursues dominance openly, they are labeled dangerous. These labels are not random. They are behavioral deterrents. They send a message to everyone watching: do not behave like this. Because humans are tribal creatures, social exile once meant death. The fear of being rejected by the group still runs deep inside the nervous system.
Once you understand the machinery of moral power, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every hierarchy on Earth, every company, every government, every tribe, every social circle, quietly divides men into three categories, not officially, but functionally. Three psychological roles that repeat themselves across centuries: the rulers, the enforcers, the obedient. Most men never realize which role they occupy. They simply move through life reacting to pressure without understanding the structure shaping them. But the structure is always there, and once you see it, you can never unsee it. The first group is the smallest, the rulers. These are not necessarily the loudest people in the room. They are not always politicians or celebrities. In fact, many rulers remain deliberately invisible. What defines them is something far more dangerous. They are comfortable with power. They do not panic when authority appears. They do not feel moral anxiety when making decisions that affect others. They do not apologize for influence. Power does not disturb their identity. It feels natural. Rulers understand something most people never learn. Hierarchies are inevitable. Someone will always control resources, information, and direction. The only question is who. And rulers intend for the answer to be them. They study systems, they analyze incentives, they observe weaknesses in structures and people. Where others see rules, rulers see mechanisms. Where others see limitations, rulers see leverage. But rulers cannot maintain power alone, which leads to the second group, the enforcers. This group is larger, louder, and far more visible. Enforcers are the guardians of the system. They are the managers, administrators, moral advocates, social referees, and loyal defenders of whatever hierarchy currently exists. Enforcers believe deeply in structure. They believe in rules. They believe in maintaining order. And because they believe these things sincerely, they become extremely effective at protecting them. If rulers design systems, enforcers maintain them. They enforce policies. They defend cultural norms. They punish deviation. But here is the critical psychological detail. Enforcers rarely believe they are protecting power structures. They believe they are protecting fairness. This belief makes them relentless. When someone challenges the system, when someone behaves too independently, too aggressively, too unapologetically, enforcers react immediately. They accuse, criticize, shame, or isolate the individual. Not because they are evil, because they believe they are preserving stability. But stability, by definition, protects whoever already sits at the top. This is why rulers rarely fight rebels directly. They allow the enforcers to do it, and the enforcers will do it enthusiastically. Which leaves the largest group of all, the obedient, the majority. The men who work, follow, adapt, and survive within the system without ever questioning its design. They are not weak. Many are intelligent, hard-working, and capable. But they are psychologically trained to operate within boundaries.
They believe success comes from compliance. They believe fairness governs outcomes. They believe morality protects them. And because they believe this, they rarely challenge the structure itself. They compete inside the cage, not outside it. Obedient individuals wait for permission. They seek approval. They fear rejection from the group. Their survival strategy is acceptance. This strategy can create comfortable lives, but it almost never produces power. Nietzsche observed something unsettling about this hierarchy. The obedient believe they are safe. The enforcers believe they are righteous, and the rulers simply observe both groups. Because the entire structure—
Once you understand the machinery of moral power, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every hierarchy on Earth, every company, every government, every tribe, every social circle, quietly divides men into three categories. Not officially, but functionally. Three psychological roles that repeat themselves across centuries: the rulers, the enforcers, the obedient. Most men never realize which role they occupy. They simply move through life reacting to pressure without understanding the structure shaping them. But the structure is always there, and once you see it, you can never unsee it. The first group is the smallest, the rulers. These are not necessarily the loudest people in the room. They are not always politicians or celebrities. In fact, many rulers remain deliberately invisible. What defines them is something far more dangerous. They are comfortable with power. They do not panic when authority appears. They do not feel moral anxiety when making decisions that affect others. They do not apologize for influence. Power does not disturb their identity. It feels natural. Rulers understand something most people never learn. Hierarchies are inevitable. Someone will always control resources, information, and direction. The only question is who. And rulers intend for the answer to be them. They study systems, they analyze incentives, they observe weaknesses in structures and people. Where others see rules, rulers see mechanisms. Where others see limitations, rulers see leverage. But rulers cannot maintain power alone, which leads to the second group, the enforcers. This group is larger, louder, and far more visible. Enforcers are the guardians of the system. They are the managers, administrators, moral advocates, social referees, and loyal defenders of whatever hierarchy currently exists. Enforcers believe deeply in structure. They believe in rules. They believe in maintaining order. And because they believe these things sincerely, they become extremely effective at protecting them. If rulers design systems, enforcers maintain them. They enforce policies. They defend cultural norms. They punish deviation. But here is the critical psychological detail. Enforcers rarely believe they are protecting power structures. They believe they are protecting fairness. This belief makes them relentless. When someone challenges the system, when someone behaves too independently, too aggressively, too unapologetically, enforcers react immediately. They accuse, criticize, shame, or isolate the individual. Not because they are evil, because they believe they are preserving stability. But stability, by definition, protects whoever already sits at the top. This is why rulers rarely fight rebels directly. They allow the enforcers to do it, and the enforcers will do it enthusiastically. Which leaves the largest group of all, the obedient, the majority. The men who work, follow, adapt, and survive within the system without ever questioning its design. They are not weak. Many are intelligent, hard-working, and capable. But they are psychologically trained to operate within boundaries. They believe success comes from compliance. They believe fairness governs outcomes. They believe morality protects them.
And because they believe this, they rarely challenge the structure itself. They compete inside the cage, not outside it. Obedient individuals wait for permission. They seek approval. They fear rejection from the group. Their survival strategy is acceptance. This strategy can create comfortable lives, but it almost never produces power. Nietzsche observed something unsettling about this hierarchy. The obedient believe they are safe. The enforcers believe they are righteous, and the rulers simply observe both groups, because the entire structure depends on a quiet illusion. The obedient believe the enforcers represent justice. The enforcers believe they represent morality. But the rulers understand something both groups do not. They represent control. And control does not require majority support. It requires strategic positioning. This is why rulers often allow the enforcers to dominate public conversations about morality. While the enforcers argue about fairness and virtue, the rulers quietly manage resources, networks, and influence behind the scenes. Public moral debate becomes a distraction. Power moves elsewhere, and the obedient rarely notice, because they are focused on surviving inside the rules. But the moment a man begins studying this structure instead of obeying it, his perception shifts permanently. He begins recognizing behavioral patterns everywhere. He sees which individuals enforce rules aggressively. He sees who quietly directs decisions behind the curtain. He sees who complies automatically. Most importantly, he begins recognizing something about himself, which role he currently occupies. And that realization is uncomfortable, because most men discover they were trained to be obedient.
Once you understand the machinery of morality and the pattern of hierarchies, a dangerous temptation appears. The temptation to rebel loudly, to expose hypocrisy, to confront the system directly. But this is the mistake of amateurs. Open rebellion triggers the immune system of society immediately. Enforcers mobilize, moral accusations appear, the rebel becomes a target. The system closes ranks and crushes the disturbance. History shows this pattern repeatedly. The loud challenger burns quickly. The strategic observer survives. This is why Nietzsche did not teach blind rebellion. He taught something far more precise: distance, strategic detachment, the ability to see the system clearly without becoming emotionally entangled in it. Because emotional reactions are predictable. Predictable men are controllable men. A strategically detached individual behaves differently. He stops reacting to every provocation. He stops arguing every moral accusation. He stops seeking approval from people who operate entirely inside the moral framework he has already outgrown. Instead, he becomes quiet, not submissive, observant. Silence is one of the most underestimated forms of power. A silent individual reveals very little about his intentions, emotions, or vulnerabilities. Others struggle to predict him, and unpredictability creates psychological tension. People instinctively trust those they can read. They become cautious around those they cannot. Strategic detachment therefore begins with a simple discipline: emotional restraint. Not because emotions are weak, but because exposed emotions are exploitable. When someone insults you, the predictable reaction is anger. When someone criticizes you morally, the predictable reaction is defense. When someone attempts social manipulation, the predictable reaction is justification. Each reaction reveals something about you: your priorities, your insecurities, your limits. But a strategically detached individual often gives none of these signals. He listens, he observes, he allows others to expose themselves while revealing almost nothing in return. Over time, this creates a quiet advantage, because most people cannot resist speaking. They explain themselves. They justify themselves. They confess their intentions through endless conversation. Meanwhile, the detached individual collects information, and information is the currency of power. The second discipline of strategic detachment is selective engagement. Not every battle deserves participation. Many conflicts exist purely to drain attention and emotional energy. Social arguments, moral debates, public outrage cycles, these arenas reward visibility, not influence. Enforcers thrive in these environments because their role is to regulate behavior publicly. They debate morality endlessly because it reinforces the authority of the moral framework itself. But rulers rarely waste time there. They operate elsewhere, behind decisions, inside networks, around resources. The strategically detached individual begins recognizing where real influence exists. Instead of fighting every moral battle, he chooses where his presence creates leverage and ignores the rest. This requires discipline because society constantly pressures individuals to react. Outrage spreads quickly. Moral controversies demand immediate opinions. Silence is often interpreted as weakness, but silence can also be strategy. The third discipline is perhaps the most uncomfortable: indifference to approval. Most people are governed by a powerful psychological desire to be seen as good by others. They want validation. They want moral recognition. They want to be accepted by the group. But approval is a leash. Anyone who depends on approval can be controlled through the threat of removing it. Praise becomes bait. Criticism becomes punishment. A strategically detached individual gradually weakens this dependency. He does not pursue social rejection deliberately, but he no longer organizes his decisions around the fear of it. This creates psychological independence, and independence disrupts control. Because once a man stops needing approval, moral accusations lose much of their force. Shame becomes ineffective. Social pressure weakens. Emotional manipulation fails. He becomes difficult to steer. This does not mean he becomes hostile to society. It means he becomes selective. He chooses alliances deliberately. He respects competence. He observes loyalty carefully. He participates where mutual benefit exists. But he no longer assumes the system is designed for his protection. He treats it as terrain. Terrain must be navigated, studied, exploited when necessary, avoided when dangerous. This mindset transforms behavior quietly but completely. The man who once reacted emotionally now analyzes. The man who once sought approval now evaluates incentives. The man who once obeyed moral narratives now studies the structures behind them. And with each step of detachment, something else fades. Naivety. The belief that the world rewards virtue automatically. The belief that fairness governs outcomes. The belief that obedience leads to power. Those illusions dissolve. What replaces them is colder, but far more accurate. Because strategic detachment is not about rejecting morality entirely. It is about understanding when morality functions as guidance and when it functions as control. Once you see that difference clearly, your behavior begins changing automatically. You move more carefully. You speak more deliberately. You reveal less. And the system that once shaped your reactions begins losing its grip. But this shift creates a deeper problem. Because when a man stops living according to the identity society designed for him, he must confront the identity he has been protecting his entire life. And that confrontation is where most people retreat. Because what comes next is not adjustment. It is transformation. By the time you reach this point, the problem is no longer intellectual. You understand the structure.
You see the machinery. You recognize the hierarchy. But knowledge alone does not change a man. Identity does. And this is where most people stop. Because the final barrier to power is not the system. It is the version of yourself the system created. From childhood, you were given an identity template, a psychological blueprint for how a good person behaves. It came through parents, schools, institutions, culture, religion, and social expectations. And the template looked something like this. Be agreeable. Be cooperative. Avoid conflict. Respect authority. Share credit. Seek approval. Follow rules. These behaviors are rewarded constantly. Teachers praise them. Employers prefer them. Social groups celebrate them. Because they produce stable individuals, predictable individuals, manageable individuals. But stability and power rarely occupy the same space. A man who is conditioned to avoid conflict cannot lead aggressively. A man who depends on approval cannot dominate strategically. A man who fears moral judgment cannot make difficult decisions. The identity of the obedient individual becomes a prison, and prisons built from identity are far stronger than prisons built from walls. This is why Nietzsche described transformation as self-overcoming. Not improvement, not self-help. Overcoming. Destroying the psychological structure that limits you and replacing it with something stronger. But identity death is not comfortable, because the obedient identity has protected you for years. It helped you survive social environments. It earned approval. It prevented rejection. Killing it feels dangerous. And in a sense, it is. The moment you stop behaving predictably, people around you will notice. They will sense the shift immediately. Your silence will feel strange. Your boundaries will feel cold. Your refusal to apologize for ambition will feel threatening. And the system will respond exactly the way it always responds, with pressure. Moral accusations will appear. You've changed. You're becoming arrogant. You're not the same person anymore. These phrases are rarely compliments. They are signals. Signals that the system is attempting to pull you back into your original role. Because identity transformation disrupts expectations, and disrupted expectations make people uncomfortable. But this pressure reveals something important. Your old identity was not only serving you, it was serving.
By now, the illusion should be gone. You have seen the machinery of morality. You have seen the architecture of hierarchy. You have seen the identity prison most men live inside. And if you are still listening, it means one thing. Something in you already suspected this. Because the majority of people never reach this point. They turn away long before the truth becomes uncomfortable. They reject the idea that morality can be used as a weapon. They reject the idea that hierarchies are permanent. They reject the idea that identity itself can be engineered by society. Not because the evidence is weak, but because the cost of accepting it is too high. Accepting it means realizing that much of what you were taught was not designed to empower you. It was designed to stabilize the system around you. And once that realization enters the mind, it becomes impossible to return to innocence. You begin noticing things others ignore. You notice how quickly crowds attack individuals who step outside moral expectations. You notice how aggressively people defend systems that quietly limit them. You notice how uncomfortable society becomes when someone stops apologizing for ambition. This discomfort is not accidental. It is protective. Systems protect themselves. They defend the behaviors that keep them stable, and they attack the behaviors that threaten to destabilize them.
This is why individuals who pursue autonomy often encounter resistance, not only from institutions, but from ordinary people. Friends become uneasy, colleagues become suspicious, family members question your change in attitude, not necessarily because they wish you harm, but because your transformation challenges their own assumptions. If you reject the identity they accepted without question, it forces them to confront the possibility that their obedience was never required. And that is a terrifying thought. So they pressure you to return, to soften, to compromise, to behave like the person they remember. Most people surrender here. They retreat back into the familiar identity society assigned them. They tell themselves that ambition is dangerous, that power corrupts, that obedience is virtue. And slowly the illusion rebuilds itself. Comfort returns, but so does limitation. Nietzsche believed this was the quiet tragedy of human potential. Not that people lack strength, but that they are trained to fear it, trained to distrust their own will, trained to seek approval instead of sovereignty. The system does not need to imprison them, they regulate themselves. But occasionally a different type of individual appears, someone who refuses to return to sleep, someone who studies power instead of denying it, someone who examines morality instead of worshiping it, someone who builds an identity deliberately rather than inheriting one blindly. These individuals are rare, not because intelligence is rare, but because courage is. It takes courage to accept that the world is not governed by fairness. It takes courage to abandon the comfort of approval. It takes courage to operate independently of the narratives everyone else repeats. But once that courage appears, something changes permanently. The man who once reacted emotionally now observes strategically. The man who once obeyed instinctively now chooses deliberately. The man who defended systems now studies them. And this shift creates a different kind of presence. Quiet, unpredictable, difficult to manipulate. The system can pressure him, but it cannot easily control him, because control requires psychological leverage, and psychological leverage disappears when a man stops needing the approval the system offers. This is Nietzsche's final warning. Most people will hear ideas like these and dismiss them immediately. They will call them cynical, dangerous, immoral. Not because they are false, but because they threaten the moral framework that keeps their identity stable. And without that framework, they would be forced to rebuild themselves from the ground up. Few are willing to do that, which is why hierarchies remain stable generation after generation. Not because power is unbeatable, but because awakening is rare. So the warning remains simple. If you truly understand what you have heard today, you cannot return to the comfortable illusion that once guided you. You will start seeing power where others see virtue, strategy where others see fairness, structure where others see chaos. And from that moment forward, a quiet decision begins shaping your life. You can continue living inside the moral story you were given, or you can step outside it and begin writing your own. Most men will never choose the second path, but the few who do become something society does not easily categorize. Not obedient, not rebellious, something far more dangerous: independent.